Dreams for the PS4 is a wonderful tool for creating music, art, and games. In this video, I present to you some helpful tips for using Dreams and also go into detail about the inner workings of some of the objects in my game I made in Dreams. Please see the video description for information as to how to play my game. Whenever you create logic, no matter how simple or complex, always start with a microchip and promptly name it. You can also change its icon and color to make it clear what the chip does. If you have a lot of logic which can be broken into different tasks, then put the logic for a particular task into its own chip within the main chip, which will make it clearer what is happening and easier to debug. If you have lots of wires entering or exiting chips, including chips within chips, use ports which should be named so it's obvious the function of each wire. As with microchips, change the port's icon and color if you feel that will get better across the port's purpose. Inputting text with the virtual keyboard is slow, so instead use a wired or wireless USB keyboard connected to your PS4. You can use Ctrl and A to select all the text, or hold Shift and use arrow keys left and right to select just some of the text. Whichever method you use, the text won't be highlighted. Use Ctrl and C to copy and Ctrl and V to paste text. Home and N keys move to the beginning and the end of the text. Return saves the text you've entered, and Escape cancels your changes. Although the keyboard works when naming an object you want to save, copy and paste doesn't work. If you're having trouble getting something to work, you can use a text displayer or number displayer to output useful information, and switches can be used to turn the debug displays on or off. Speaking of switches, they can also be useful for overrides or for deactivating logic. Logic contained in a chip can easily be turned on or off with a switch to help isolate problems. Whenever you have lots of logic, the wiring can become messy, making it difficult to understand how it works or to debug it. One way to neaten up the wiring is to add wire nodes using X, and once added, a wire node can be grabbed and moved using X or R2, allowing you to shape wires to your liking. Tidying up the wiring should be done once you are happy the logic is working. Although it can take a lot of time to neaten the wiring, the results make the effort well worth it. Likely you will want your player character to always start at a set position in a scene, and this can be done by adding a teleporter to the player object and entering a tag name. Make sure that match target orientation is selected so that the player faces the same way as the start position tag that will be used as a starting point. Add to your puppet's logic a timer that very briefly powers on the teleporter. In your scene, add a tag to where you want the player to start and name it the same as the tag name in the player's teleporter. Now when your scene starts, the player will start from where you placed the tag. You can use a similar technique for other objects, such as these arrows are made, which start moving from a set position when triggered. There are 3 arrows in this scene, and each one has its own corresponding tag, so when triggered, the arrow knows where to start from. In my game, there is a key which when collected causes a pillar to fall. This key otherwise continually rotates using a rotator. A trigger zone detects the player. When the player is detected, it sets the key collected variable to 1. A counter remembers that the player was detected and causes the key collected sound to play, and the pickup effect is powered on. The output of the counter is also fed to a NOT gate, making the key no longer visible. Because the key was never set to be collidable and we're using a trigger zone to detect the player, there was no need to turn off collidable when the key was collected. You could use a destroyer to remove the key when it's collected, but then the key collect sound wouldn't finish playing. For the pillar that falls when you collect the key, there is a hidden box which allows the pillar to rotate about the box using a motor bolt which is powered on when the key is collected. The logic for the pillar uses a variable modifier to detect when the key was collected, which powers on the motor bolt so the pillar falls. When the key is collected, it also increases the count of a counter, triggering the camera shake, controller rumble, and pillar falling sounds. A trigger zone detects when the pillar comes into contact with the ground and plays the pillar impact sound, as well as returning the counter to its initial value so that the screen shake, controller rumble, and pillar falling sounds turn off. In my game, the player collects 4 jewels, which are to be inserted into a plinth, although so far there are only 2 to collect in this version. For each of the 4 jewels you can collect, there is a dedicated variable which has initial value of 0, but changes to 1 when it's collected, and then becomes 2 when it's placed in the plinth. The Plymouth Logic is a little bit complicated. There is a chip that detects the player, which contains a chip for each jewel position and uses a trigger zone to detect if the player is in front of a jewel position in the plinth. If the player is in front of a jewel slot and has the associated jewel, then the jewel collected variable is changed to 2. The same trigger zone is also used in another chip that handles the jewel hints, which in turn has a chip to handle the hint for each jewel, whether the jewel is missing or has been placed in the plinth. For selecting the appropriate hint to display, the trigger zone is fed through some logic. If the player doesn't have the associated jewel, the "something is missing" text is displayed. But if the jewel has been collected or inserted, the "fits nicely" message shows. Lastly, if a jewel has been inserted, we visually display a copy of the jewel and make it collidable. There are a number of lanterns which flicker randomly, and they work by controlling the lantern's glow value. The lantern can externally be turned on and off using a light switch if need be. The override signal is fed into the switch controls chip, which has an internal power switch and a flicker on-off switch. If flicker has been disabled, then a slider can be used to set the lantern's brightness, which affects the lantern's glow. The bulb flicker control signal powers the bulb flicker chip, which contains flicker frequency and flicker time timers. The effect is that the lantern's glow will go low and then high after a random amount of time, with the flicker time timer controlling the lantern's glow. There is a point in the game where you need to burn some vines to return to the hub area, and this involves collecting 3 blowtorch pieces. Looking inside the blowtorch itself and its chip, you can see a trigger zone detects the player, which in turn advances the counter to 1. When the counter's value is 0, the blowtorch is visible, but disappears when the counter value is 1. Which also causes the collected effect to trigger, the blowtorch collected variable to be set to 1, and the collected sound to play. Very similar logic is used for the other two Blowtorch pieces, which set their own unique variable when collected. The vines are grouped with the fire object, which is invisible until enabled. The fire itself is an animated painting that has its own chip, which generates the crackling sound, and a signal generator to make the fire appear to flicker. Looking at the vines themselves, in its chip there is a lot going on, but it can be broken into a number of tasks. A counter remembers the object's current state and will be a value from 0 to 3. When it's 0, it checks if the player is in the hub and touching the vines, and if so, displays an appropriate message. Otherwise, if the player is underground and touching the vines, a different message will appear. If the player is underground and touching the vines without any Blowtorch pieces, then a message is shown to hint to the player what to do. However, if only the Blowtorch has been collected, then a hint will appear that there are other pieces to collect. If all pieces have been collected and the player touches the vines, then the counter will advance to the value 1. During state 1, a timer will be powered, so there is a slight delay before the flames appear. When the time reaches its target value, the counter moves to state 2. Now the flames are showing, the player will be harmed when making contact with the fire, which is done using a health modifier. A sound will also be triggered when the flames first appear, and a timer will run, which determines how long the flames are active for. When the timer runs out, the counter moves to its last state. State 3 is very simple. It destroys the vines and the fire. There is a simple puzzle which rewards the player with the red jewel when completed, and it involves guiding the jewel holder over 4 coloured shapes in order. Each shape has a microchip which contains a trigger zone which detects when the jewel holder comes in contact with it and then transmits the status using a wireless transmitter. In the torch manager, there is a chip which simply sets the hue of each torch's flame. The progress of the torch puzzle is stored in a counter, and the current value of the counter determines what torches, if any, are lit. The counter value is also checked by 4 microchips to determine if, based on current progress and the signals from the puzzle shapes, the puzzle progress counter value should be increased by 1. If that happens, a sound is played, but if a shape is touched in the wrong order, a different sound will be played, the counter is reset, and all torches are turned off. When the counter is increased by 1 4 times, the puzzle is completed, a completion sound will play, and a signal will be sent to say that the puzzle is finished. The red jewel holder uses a counter to determine its current mode. 0 means it can be moved by the buttons, 1 means it's moving automatically to its final position, and 2 causes a signal to be transmitted to say it's in its final position. A microchip handles moving the holder by checking for a wireless signal to indicate the direction to move. And either the move horizontal or move vertical chip actually causes movement. If we look inside the move horizontal chip, we can see the appropriate wireless signals are fed in to start movement either left or right, which is latched in by the relevant counter. To set the direction and speed of movement, a calculator is enabled and an advanced mover handles the actual movement. Two trigger zones detect if a barrier has been hit to the left or right, and should this happen, the movement counter is reset to stop movement. The move vertical chip is very similar, but of course moves the holder up and down. If there is any movement in any direction, a sound is played and a signal is sent so that the movement isn't interrupted. If the torch puzzle complete signal is received, then a timer activates, which in turn advances the main counter by 1, resulting in the move to final position chip activating. The holder is now moving on a set path and uses the barrier detect trigger zones to know when to change direction automatically. A counter remembers the current movement direction, and 4 calculators check the counter current value to then transmit a direction signal to itself as if the player had hit one of the buttons. When all movements have completed, the counter will reach its final value, which will increase the main counter by 1, now having a value of 2. This causes a signal to be sent to say that the holder is in its final position. The switches used to guide the jewel holder operate like old-fashioned radio buttons, in that when one is pressed, the previously pressed button is forced out. There are a number of inputs to the radio button, one of which is the inhibit, which stops the switch from reacting to the player so that there is no reaction when the jewel holder is moving. An unused input, press switch, causes the button to react as if pressed by the player. Release switch forces a switch to return to its not pressed position. A counter, switch pressed completely, remembers whether the switch has moved in all the way, and the latch signal is provided as an output. Another counter stores whether the button has released fully, that is, ready to be pressed again. These counters are operated by 2 trigger zones, which detect when the switch is pressed or released fully. An impact sensor reacts to the player hitting the switch, and this is checked against the output of a trigger zone to limit where exactly on the switch the player can hit for it to respond. The resulting logic is connected to a switch pressed output. Before reacting to the player, the signal is put through other logic to make sure that the switch hasn't been inhibited and that it has been fully released. If indeed the switch can react to the player, in the move switch in chip, a counter latches a mover so that the switch moves in. When a trigger zone detects that the switch cannot move anymore in, it turns off the counter so that the switch stops moving. If the button receives the release switch signal, then in the move switch out chip, it checks that the switch is not already in its fully released position, and if so, a counter advances to 1 so that a mover moves the switch out. Similar to when the switch moves in, a trigger zone detects that the switch has fully moved out. The push switch manager interfaces with the 4 radio buttons, handles the move in-out action, plays the various sounds, and wirelessly transmits the state of the switches for the jewel holder. When a switch is initially pressed, the signal is sent to the handle switch pressed sound chip, which plays the press button sound provided the shape puzzle hasn't been completed. If a switch has already been pushed in, we may need to push out other switches, and we have a counter to remember if it's the first time a button was pressed. In the chip that handles the push in-out action, provided the jewel holder isn't moving and we receive a signal to say a switch has moved all the way in, we use some logic to tell all other buttons to release themselves. Due to the radio button's internal logic, only the one that was previously pressed will release itself. Lastly, we have the chip that transmits the state of the buttons. When it receives a signal that a switch has moved all the way in, the appropriate direction signal is wirelessly transmitted unless the shape puzzle was completed. We also check if any switches were pressed so that we can advance the previously mentioned counter when it's the first time a button has been pressed. Thanks for watching. I hope that this video has been interesting and the tips useful, and the insight into how I put together what I have done so far in my game an eye-opener. Please like and subscribe to show your support for my channel. Take care, happy gaming, bye for now.